Beneath the ruins of war lie stories never meant to be told. Convoys that vanished into smoke, laboratories buried in ice, archives burned to ash yet whispered about in locked rooms. They are fragments of history sealed under false names, redacted, in black ink, erased from memory. But silence cannot erase the truth forever. These shadows remain, waiting to be unearthed, carrying with them a warning. Some secrets were buried not to protect us, but to protect themselves. On the evening of April 28, 1945, with Soviet artillery already striking the outskirts of central Berlin, a column of trucks moved silently through the shadows of the Tiergarten. Witnesses, civilian survivors hiding in cellars, later recalled seeing vehicles bearing Wehrmacht plates, but escorted by SS officers in plain black uniforms. The convoy, estimated at 8 to 10 vehicles, was recorded in one final radio transmission under the codename Eisensturm. After that, it disappeared from both German and Allied documentation. For decades, historians assumed these were routine evacuation efforts. Yet fragments of post-war interrogation reports suggest something far more deliberate. Colonel Erich Albrecht, attached to the Führer's chancellery, testified under British custody in 1946 that he had received sealed orders concerning priority cargo that was to be removed from Berlin at all costs. The contents, he insisted, were unknown even to him, but the orders bore the red Reichssicherheitsdienst seal, the highest level of SS secrecy classification. The convoy's supposed destination was never disclosed, but scattered pieces of evidence point towards southern Germany. In a declassified OSS memorandum dated June 12, 1945, agents operating in Bavaria noted a sudden spike in unmarked vehicles traveling along Alpine routes, many later confirmed to be ferrying Nazi officials seeking refuge. Yet one particular intelligence cable, labeled Intercept B47 Alpen, refers cryptically to engineering crates and archival cargo, terms that suggest something beyond personal belongings or looted art. What these crates contained has been the subject of speculation for more than half a century. Some theories propose they carried advanced weapons research, perhaps documentation from the V-weapons program at Peenemünde, or the abandoned uranium experiments of Heisenberg's team. Others point toward evidence of collaboration networks, dossiers, listing foreign sympathizers, financiers, or intelligence contacts across neutral countries. The most unsettling hypothesis comes from Soviet archives opened briefly in the 1990s. A note from NKVD Major Ivan Burov describing biological documentation and laboratory samples rumored to have been shipped out of Berlin days before the city's fall. The first confirmed trace of the convoy emerges months after Germany's surrender. In September 1945, a British officer stationed in Innsbruck reported a burned-out truck found in a ravine near the Brenner Pass. Among the wreckage were fragments of paperwork, partly scorched but bearing the Reich Eagle watermark. One slip, later catalogued as document fragment K17, referenced Abteilung 6B, a division of the Sicherheitsdienst responsible for foreign intelligence. Curiously, this fragment never appeared in official British archives until its rediscovery in 1979, raising questions about whether it was intentionally suppressed. Meanwhile, in Argentina, evidence points to possible fragments of the missing cargo. In 1947, Argentine customs officials confiscated sealed wooden crates arriving at Buenos Aires under diplomatic cover. The crates were quickly released following intervention by President Juan Perón's government, but an anonymous customs clerk later described seeing technical blueprints written in German script before the items were removed. When US intelligence attempted to trace these crates, their inquiry was abruptly closed under the label non-priority investigation. The EST's strongest lead came decades later, buried in the Central Intelligence Agency's own Cold War records. A 1962 memorandum to Director John McCone, declassified only in 2011, discussed rumors of Eisensturm documents resurfacing in Perón's Argentina. The memo referenced a network of former SS officers including Otto Skorzeny, facilitating the transfer of wartime archives to South America. Though no definitive proof emerged, the persistence of such references across multiple agencies suggests the files were never destroyed, but rather dispersed through clandestine networks. Why? Would Allied governments conceal the fate of this convoy? The most likely explanation is geopolitical utility. If the crates contained lists of collaborators or records of covert funding, their exposure could have embarrassed Western corporations and governments that had dealings with the Reich. Similarly, if advanced weapons research or biological materials were involved, both Washington and Moscow had clear incentives to absorb the data quietly rather than reveal its existence. One chilling footnote comes from a 1954 French intelligence report, unearthed in the archives of the SDECE. It describes a meeting between a former SS logistics officer and an unidentified buyer in Madrid. During the meeting, the officer allegedly produced microfilm reels labeled Eisensturm Archive. The CE buyer, believed to be acting on behalf of a US front company, paid a sum equivalent to $500,000 in today's currency. Afterward, the officer disappeared without trace. Today, the fate of Operation Eisensturm remains officially unsolved. German, American, British, and Russian archives each contain fragments of the story, but none align fully with the others. The burned truck at Brenner Pass, the crates in Buenos Aires, the Madrid transaction, all suggest that at least part of the cargo survived the war. What is conspicuously absent is any formal acknowledgement of its nature. When confronted with the question in 1998, a retired CIA analyst admitted off record, the Eisensturm material was never about treasure, it was leverage. Whoever controlled it could shape the narrative of the war and the peace that followed. Whether he referred to weapons research, incriminating documents, or something darker remains unknown. 75 years later, the streets of Berlin have been rebuilt, the Tiergarten restored, the Reich Chancellery reduced to rubble beneath modern concrete. Yet somewhere, locked in a vault or scattered across continents, the contents of those trucks remain, classified, concealed, and perhaps still dangerous. Operation Eisensturm represents one of the most enduring mysteries of the war's chaotic end. A ghost convoy that carried the weight of a vanishing empire, and with it, secrets powerful enough to be hidden for generations. In March 1944, a joint German-Allied weather station was established on the remote northeast coast of Greenland, under the designation Base N22. Official records describe it as a meteorological outpost vital for transatlantic convoy forecasting, but declassified cables and testimonies reveal a far stranger purpose. Staffed by a mixture of Kriegsmarine meteorologists, captured Allied specialists, and later US Navy observers after the German surrender, the base became the site of a series of unexplained incidents that would haunt intelligence archives for decades. The project's origins lay in the desperate battle for Atlantic supply routes. By 1942, both sides recognized that control of accurate weather prediction could decide naval operations. German weather ships, such as Lauenburg, had been hunted down, forcing the Reich to establish secret Arctic stations. One of these, later codenamed N22, was positioned near Shannon Island. Its existence was largely unknown until a captured German radioman revealed the coordinates under interrogation in 1944. Rather than destroy it, Allied command authorized a covert takeover, incorporating the facility into their own network while concealing its origins. The files that remain describe how in August 1944, US Navy engineers installed a classified radio apparatus at N22, code-labeled System Argus. Its function was never disclosed in operational records, but fragments suggest it was designed to capture low-frequency transmissions believed to originate far beyond standard Soviet radio bands. A surviving logbook entry, later retrieved from Danish archives, recorded unexplained interference bursts during midnight hours, phenomena which technicians could not attribute to atmospheric conditions. By November 1944, reports of illness began circulating among the multinational crew. Initially dismissed as scurvy or exposure, the symptoms escalated rapidly. Sudden nosebleeds, neurological spasms, and disorientation. Medical requests were transmitted to command, but weather prevented evacuation flights. 2 fatalities were recorded in December. Their bodies were sealed in the ice and never recovered. Shortly afterward, Base N-22's communications ceased for 3 consecutive days. When contact resumed, the radioman on duty signed with a different call sign, one previously associated with a defunct German station. This anomaly sparked panic within Allied intelligence. OSS memoranda from January 1945 flagged N-22 as compromised asset, but no recovery mission was dispatched until the summer thaw. When Danish sled patrols finally reached the site in July, they reported abandoned structures, overturned equipment, and a peculiar scorch mark near the radio hut. Inside, they found the apparatus partially dismantled, wires stripped as if someone had attempted to sabotage or remove its core components. No personnel remained, nor were any graves found. The site was hastily sealed and classified. For the next decade, Base N-22 lingered in obscurity. It resurfaced only during the early Cold War, when US Air Force reconnaissance flights conducted aerial surveys of Greenland's coast. In 1957, satellite photographs under Project Corona showed the collapsed remains of the station, but also indicated a sealed entry beneath the ice, distinct from the surface structures. A 1961 CIA field report noted unusual electromagnetic readings in the vicinity, strong enough to disrupt aircraft instruments. The report was marked eyes only and filed away. Speculation grew within both NATO and Warsaw Pact circles. Some believed the apparatus installed in 1944 was an experimental ELF, extremely low-frequency, antenna, designed to detect submerged U-boats or even Soviet submarine communications years ahead of known technology. Others argued it was tied to atmospheric experiments linked to ionospheric warfare research. Yet the persistent rumors of outbreaks and neurological symptoms raised darker questions. Was Base N-22 part of an early biological or radiological test field conducted far from populated areas? Hints of Soviet interest emerged after 1968, when the US B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed near Thule Air Base, Greenland. Danish intelligence files reveal that Soviet trawlers were operating unusually close to the region at the time. One declassified cable from Copenhagen mentioned fears that Moscow sought access to archival stations, almost certainly a reference to N-22. Despite official denials, US engineers secretly resurveyed the Shannon Island area in 1972. Their report concluded with the line, "Residual emissions continue. Site integrity uncertain. Recommend permanent denial measures." But the site was never demolished. Instead, N-22 vanished once again beneath advancing ice sheets. Local Inuit hunters interviewed in the late 1980s described sealed entrances visible during summer melts, along with metal sounds reverberating beneath the glacier. Whether these accounts were folklore or echoes from shifting ice remains impossible to verify. The surviving documentary trail ends abruptly. The last reference to Base N-22 in US archives is a heavily redacted 1983 Defense Intelligence Agency memo. Monitoring discontinued. Contamination unresolved. Danish authorities maintain silence on the matter, classifying all files related to Shannon Island under sovereign security. Requests by researchers have been consistently denied. What happened at N-22 remains buried, literally and figuratively, beneath Greenland's ice. A station that began as a meteorological outpost became entangled in shadow operations. Its technology lost, its crew unaccounted for, its purpose obscured by Cold War secrecy. All that is left are fragmented logs, unexplained transmissions, and the haunting suggestion that something was left running in those frozen barracks long after their operators disappeared. In the waning days of the Pacific War, as Allied forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the Imperial Navy deployed a fleet of massive submarines, known as the Sentoku class. Built in secrecy at Kure Naval Arsenal, these I-400 series vessels were the largest of their kind at the time, capable of carrying aircraft and striking targets thousands of miles from Japan. Among them, the submarine I-402 was outfitted not for combat, but for transport, stripped of its aviation hangar and repurposed to carry sealed cargo under a classified project designation. Payload Black Orchid. The designation appears only in fragments of captured Japanese documents seized at the end of the war. One surviving naval directive, catalogued by Allied translators in October 1945, instructs I-402's commander to deliver biological material of strategic importance to the port of Dairen in Manchuria, then under Japanese control. The wording was deliberately vague, but the phrase strategic importance was underlined, a rarity in Japanese military correspondence. The directive bore the stamp of the Naval Technical Research Institute, the same body linked to Unit 731's program of experimental warfare. The submarine departed Kure on August 2, 1945. US Signals Intelligence tracked its movement briefly, then lost contact northeast of Okinawa. No confirmed record of I-402's arrival exists. Japanese surrender documents submitted weeks later omit the vessel entirely, listing her as unaccounted. In 1947, US occupation authorities in Tokyo received a report from fishermen in the Kuril Islands who claimed to have encountered a massive wreck protruding from shallow waters near Shimashire. The fishermen described metallic debris that burned the hands when touched, and a stench like rotten meat mixed with medicine. When word reached local Soviet authorities, the area was immediately cordoned off. Soviet naval trawlers were observed operating in the region for months thereafter, but no public announcement was made. Declassified CIA memoranda from the early 1950s reveal growing unease in Washington. A 1952 briefing note titled Black Orchid, missing vessel warns that hostile power has likely recovered sensitive biological or technical material from Japanese source. The memo references intercepted Soviet correspondence describing special cargo from captured submarine. Analysts at the time feared this might involve bacteriological agents, possibly anthrax or plague cultures developed at Unit 731. Yet other fragments suggest something more experimental, disease vectors intended for wide area dispersal. Evidence remained circumstantial until the release of Soviet naval files in the brief period of glasnost during the 1990s. Among them was an after-action report by Captain Mikhail Dubrov, commander of a salvage flotilla operating in the Kurils in late 1945. Dubrov's log describes recovery operations on a large Japanese underwater vessel, partially submerged, leaking fluids. He noted sealed steel canisters, some damaged, which were transferred under guard to Vladivostok. His final entry, dated December 3, 1945, states, "Cargo relocated to Khabarovsk facilities under NKVD directive. Crew disposed of by order." No further mention of the canisters appears in open Soviet archives. If Dubrov's report is accurate, I-402's mission ended not in Manchuria, but at the bottom of the Kuril chain, its cargo seized by Soviet hands. What became of payload Black Orchid is left only to inference. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union invested heavily in biological warfare programs, often with startling advances that outpaced Western estimates. Whether those advances derived in part from materials salvaged from I-402 is a question that remains unanswered. Meanwhile, the wreck itself has remained elusive. Western expeditions to the Kurils in the 1970s found no trace of I-402. Soviet military hydrographic maps list several restricted zones marked only as hazardous seabed, including one near Shimashire that aligns with the fishermen's original testimony. Japanese naval historians petitioned for access in the 1980s, but were denied. Today, the Russian Federation maintains strict control of the waters, citing navigational risks from volcanic activity. One tantalizing clue surfaced in 1965 when an American reconnaissance satellite captured imagery of an unusual naval facility near Khabarovsk. Analysts noted long, warehouse-like structures with heavy ventilation systems, uncommon for the region. The facility was linked to the Soviet Ministry of Defense's biopreparat network decades later, but at the time its purpose was labeled only as unclear strategic significance. The fate of I-402 has become a legend among naval historians, whispered about in classified seminars and footnotes buried in Cold War files. Official Japanese wartime logs remain incomplete. US Navy records insist the submarine was never recovered, and Russian archives deny holding any material from the vessel. Yet the scattered fragments, intercepts, testimonies, Dubrov's log, form the outline of a darker truth, that in the final desperate weeks of the war, Japan attempted to transfer something catastrophic, and its capture shaped the covert arms race that followed. For decades, Western analysts searched for evidence that payload Black Orchid was ever weaponized. None has surfaced conclusively, though rumors persist of unexplained outbreaks in the Soviet Far East during the late 1940s, hastily attributed to natural causes. Declassified CDC cables from 1949 note unusual plague incidents near Khabarovsk, consistent with the timing of Dubrov's reported transfer. Whether coincidence or consequence remains unsettled. What lingers is the sense of deliberate omission. Allied surrender interrogations asked about experimental submarines and special cargo, yet Japanese officers consistently deflected, claiming ignorance. US intelligence abruptly closed its Black Orchid file in 1956, the same year the Soviet Union announced significant advances in aerosolized biological dispersal. The correlation may be coincidence, but the silence around I-402 has all the hallmarks of intentional suppression. The Pacific seabed keeps its secrets well. If I-402 still lies somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Kurils, her steel hull entombed in silt, the remnants of her sealed cargo may remain inside, untouched, decaying, or worse, preserved. A submarine erased from surrender logs, a payload spoken of only in fragments, and a chain of events that intersects with one of the darkest arms races of the Cold War. Officially, I-402 never existed. Unofficially, she may have carried into the deep the most dangerous cargo of the Second World War. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, the Allies scrambled to seize whatever remained of the Reich's advanced weapons programs. Operation Paperclip brought dozens of scientists to the United States, but lesser known is what was spirited eastward. Soviet forces overran large parts of Saxony and Thuringia, uncovering research facilities linked to Peenemünde. Among the documents captured were blueprints and partial prototypes tied to a program codenamed Project Morgenlicht, a high-altitude interceptor allegedly capable of transcontinental flight. The first reference to Morgenlicht appears in a May 1945 Red Army engineering report filed from Nordhausen. It describes aerial fuselage components, unlike conventional Luftwaffe craft, with notation suggesting use of liquid oxygen propulsion. The parts were shipped to Moscow under NKVD escort. Witness testimony from German engineers later conscripted. Inter-Soviet research confirmed that a group of scientists, including several from Messerschmitt's jet division, were relocated to facilities in Kazakhstan. Their work, according to one surviving affidavit, was direct continuation of the abandoned Project Morgenlicht. Western intelligence became aware of the program in 1952, when NATO reconnaissance intercepted Soviet transmissions referring to test flights beyond the Kármán line. A declassified British Joint Intelligence Committee summary from that year speculated that the Soviets were attempting to weaponize stratospheric flight. While many dismissed this as Cold War paranoia, US Air Force photo analysts took it seriously. The most compelling piece of evidence emerged in September 1957. A U-2 spy plane piloted by Richard Bissell's squadron overflew Semipalatinsk and returned with blurred photographs of unusual contrails rising steeply from the ground, deviating from the trajectory of conventional rockets. Within days, the CIA circulated a classified report, warning that the Soviets might be developing an aircraft with suborbital reach. The report made direct mention of German antecedents, citing Peenemünde archives captured by Soviet troops. What happened next was shrouded in secrecy. In October 1959, a NATO reconnaissance mission over Kazakhstan went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft, a British Canberra PR-9, vanished from radar mid-flight. For decades, the official explanation remained mechanical failure. Yet in 1998, documents from the British National Archives revealed cockpit voice recordings recovered from the mission. In the final moments before transmission ended, one of the pilots reported being locked on by something fast, not a missile. It's climbing at impossible rate. No wreckage was ever returned. Soviet sources remained silent until the fall of the USSR. In the brief window of openness during the early 1990s, fragments of Soviet Air Force records leaked through independent researchers. One report, attributed to Colonel Viktor Myasnikov, described unidentified engagement with foreign reconnaissance plane, high atmosphere, 1959. The craft responsible was not named, but the description included tailless delta configuration and dual exhaust plasma trails. Such terminology closely matches speculative reconstructions of the Morgenlicht prototypes. Skeptics argue that Morgenlicht was nothing more than a paper project, exaggerated by Cold War paranoia. But other traces persist. A 1961 CIA briefing on the Soviet aerospace program warned of a potential gap in American defenses if Moscow possessed an aircraft capable of bypassing radar coverage by flying above conventional altitude limits. The report was quietly shelved as US attention shifted to ballistic missiles and the space race. Yet the margin notes contain a chilling line. Possible German origin. If Morgenlicht existed, its legacy was buried within the classified archives of both superpowers. No confirmed prototype has ever been displayed, no test pilot publicly acknowledged. Yet the echoes of its existence are scattered. Blurred photographs, intercepted transmissions, inexplicable radar contacts. Even in the 1970s, NORAD logs occasionally recorded fast-mover anomalies over the Arctic, targets that climbed too steeply to be conventional aircraft, yet were dismissed as atmospheric artifacts. What motive would the Soviets have had to suppress such a project? The most plausible answer lies in strategic stability. A working Morgenlicht interceptor, capable of near-orbital reach, would have destabilized the fragile balance of deterrence. By the early 1960s, nuclear-tipped ICBMs had rendered such craft redundant. Quiet burial of the program allowed Moscow to project strength without revealing the fragile, experimental nature of its technology. Yet there remains the unanswered question of human cost. In a 1975 interview with West German television, a former Luftwaffe engineer living in Munich hinted that two of my colleagues never returned from the East. They were sent to Kazakhstan to finish something we started. They died there unrecorded. His statement was never pursued. Today, the steppes of Kazakhstan conceal little evidence of what occurred during those fevered years of Cold War experimentation. Abandoned hangars and sealed tunnels around Baikonur are attributed to early spaceflight, but their origins trace back further to the immediate aftermath of World War II. Whether Morgenlicht ever flew, whether it engaged NATO reconnaissance, whether it influenced later Soviet aerospace designs, all remain subjects of speculation. The story of Project Morgenlicht illustrates how the final months of World War II bled seamlessly into the first battles of the Cold War. A Nazi dream of stratospheric supremacy may have lived on, transplanted eastward, only to vanish again into the fog of classified history. The question that lingers is not only whether it existed, but whether its echoes are still hidden, scattered in forgotten files and sealed bunkers, waiting for the day someone is allowed to unearth the truth. When Allied troops entered Warsaw in January 1945, they uncovered a cache of SS files abandoned in the ruins of the city. Among the scorched papers were references to Action Nebelkrone, a covert project overseen by the Arne Nerby, the SS Research Institute infamous for mixing pseudoscience with brutal experimentation. The documents hinted at psychological and neurological trials conducted on prisoners of war in facilities deep within the Sudetenland, a region soon to be overrun by advancing Soviet forces. The surviving files were fragmentary but chilling. One partially legible memorandum described the use of sensory deprivation-induced seizures and chemical trials on selected captives. Another referenced a facility disguised as a mining complex, accessible only through sealed tunnels near Reichenberg, now Liberec, Czech Republic. The project's purpose was never clearly stated, but Allied interrogators speculated it sought to develop methods of psychological control or interrogation resistance. Before investigators could locate the site, the Red Army reached the region in May 1945. Within days, reports from Czech partisans described massive explosions in the mountains, detonations strong enough to collapse entire mine shafts. Soviet engineers later cordoned off the area, declaring it unsafe due to geological instability. Yet survivors from nearby villages swore that convoys of trucks had entered the tunnels just hours before the blasts, guarded by men in SS, uniforms accompanied by Soviet officers. The trail might have ended there, but in 1947, French intelligence circulated an internal bulletin noting that certain Soviet scientific bureaus are in possession of documentation consistent with German studies in sensory manipulation. The bulletin cited sources in Prague who claimed that Russian officials were conducting secret excavations at the destroyed mine sites. Western powers quietly requested access to the area, but were refused. Further confirmation emerged decades later. In 1973, a Czech border guard named Jan Kral gave testimony to a dissident journalist before fleeing to West Germany. Kral described sealed convoys escorted by Soviet security forces moving into a restricted zone near Liberec during his service in the late 1950s. He recounted one incident where a truck overturned on a mountain road. Local guards were ordered to disperse, but he glimpsed inside the crate. It was filled with folders, reels of film, and instruments like helmets with wires. Within weeks, Kral's unit was reassigned, and he was warned never to discuss the matter. Parallel evidence appears in declassified U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps (CIC) files. A 1951 report mentions rumors of Sudeten experiments involving electromagnetic exposure and forced sensory trials. Though dismissed at the time as exaggerated refugee tales, the descriptions closely match the Nebelkrone papers recovered in Warsaw. Notably, one CIC officer annotated in the margin resembles Soviet interest in behavior modification. Possible exploitation? The possibility that Nebelkrone research was absorbed into Cold War programs is reinforced by the timing. In the 1950s and 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union pursued clandestine projects in mind control and psychological warfare. M-Cultura in the West, and comparable efforts in Moscow often referred to under the vague label of psychotronics. The origins of some techniques remain obscure, but the overlap with what little is known of Nebelkrone is unsettling. Archaeological surveys of the Liberec Mountains in the 1980s recorded anomalous subsidence and unexplained heat signatures beneath certain collapsed tunnels, suggesting large sealed chambers still existed. Requests to investigate were denied by Czech authorities, citing safety hazards. To this day, portions of the region remain officially off-limits under the pretext of unstable terrain. The ultimate fate of the human subjects experimented on under Nebelkrone has never been clarified. No prisoner manifests have surfaced, no graves identified. Allied investigators in 1945 assumed the victims were destroyed in the demolitions, but scattered testimonies suggest otherwise. In 1956, a former Soviet medical officer reportedly told colleagues in Dresden that a group of test subjects was transferred east. His statement, though hearsay, aligns with other indications that not all traces of the project were buried. What lingers is the pattern of deliberate erasure. The Warsaw documents were never officially catalogued, surfacing only in footnotes decades later. Soviet archives deny the existence of Nebelkrone, while Czech state records list the Liberec mines only as collapsed industrial sites. Yet, the convergence of testimony, French intelligence in 1947, CIC files in 1951, Kral's defection in 1973, suggests that what was destroyed in the Sudetenland was not evidence, but the surface trail of something the Soviets deemed too valuable to leave behind. If Aktion Nebelkrone existed as described, it represents one of the most disturbing continuities between the crimes of the Reich and the shadow programs of the Cold War. Buried in mines and erased from files, it lives on only as whispers in classified archives and sealed zones on a map, reminders that some chapters of the war were never truly closed, but merely hidden in the dark. What lingers in the archives are not just the relics of war, but reminders of how easily truth is hidden behind walls of secrecy. Buried files, vanished convoys, erased names, each is a scar cut into history, never healed. They warn us that the past is not past at all. Somewhere beneath the ice, the rubble, or the sealed vault, the echoes remain. Echoes that whisper of what men will do when power matters more than humanity.